Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our lecture this evening. Tonight we'll be looking at the second half of our topic, Are We Here by Design or Chance? But before we get into that, we'll start with a prayer and ask God's blessing on tonight. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for bringing us all together here as a group to learn and to prove to ourselves that you are the all-powerful creator of the whole world. Father, please guide our minds and help us to soak up the information tonight so that we can all give a good answer to those who don't know of you and your purpose. Help us to develop a strong faith that we are keen to share and to spread to others. Dear Father, please bless our time together here, and we ask this prayer through your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. Now, as I mentioned before, this is the second week we are spending on our topic, Are We Here by Design or Chance? Last week, we looked at the impossibility of life evolving by chance. We saw the chance of the most basic cell structures, such as a protein and an RNA strand, forming by chance, have a probability of 1 in 10 to the power of 130, or 1 in 10 to the power of 60, both considered impossible, as they are outside the probability bound of 1 in 10 to the power of 50. Our next piece of evidence showed that there is no proof for evolution in the fossil record. All the fossils turn up fully formed without intermediate species. Pete then showed us how our universe is clearly designed because of how perfectly it supports all the specific fine-tuned requirements for life to exist on our planet. Requirements such as the right distance from the sun, that produces a white light. It's in the perfect Goldilocks zone. Lastly, we looked at some different dating methods evolutionists use to date things back millions of years, and we saw that there are plenty of inconsistencies with these, and thus they should not cause us to doubt the Bible's account of creation, occurring only thousands of years ago. Tonight, this isn't working. Here it is. Yes. That's all right, I'll just go through them like this. Tonight we'll be looking more at the evidence based off the Bible for an all-powerful creator who designed and is in control of our universe. We'll start by looking at the law of Moses and how this explains complex things we're only just finding out now as humans, such as sustainability and hygiene. Then we'll look at the evidence for a worldwide flood as described in Genesis 7. And lastly, we'll look at God's design and purpose for us as humans, being evident in how he explains the best way for us to live and interact with each other. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Pete for our first section, looking at the law of Moses.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks, Josiah. So we'll have a reading tonight, but that will be halfway through the night and related to the flood. So to start off, let's just turn up Genesis chapter 1, because I think that's a good starting point when we talk about God's purpose for this earth. So God has designed us, so that is an important consideration to consider tonight, the fact that he has designed us. And so he knows what is good for us, and there is a purpose to our lives. And as we see in Genesis chapter 1, that there is that we are made in God's image as well, which is an interesting thing to consider. And God has designed the world in a certain way so that we can interact with it, and there's synergy with the natural environment. And that is kind of built into the natural systems in the world. And in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, we can see God's original intended plan for what the purpose of our lives are. And so Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So here we can see the initial way that God created things to be. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And down to verse 29. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with its seed and its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I've given every green plant for food." And it was so. So this is kind of the foundation for the rest of the Bible in terms of how God wants us to act in the world. And we'll lead into the law of Moses a bit further on. But it's interesting that initially mankind's role was to have dominion over the animals and to work and keep the Garden of Eden. And although it's interesting to understand what this word dominion means, because initially humans were vegetarians, as we can see in the verse there. And in fact, every animal, all animals were herbivorous from the beginning. So this, not to say that's how we should be right now, but that is how God planned things from the very beginning. And it's only when we come to Noah's time, after the flood, that mankind is given meat to eat. Explicitly, God says that you can have animals to eat, because obviously it would take time for the plants to grow back after the flood. So what does this word dominion mean? Well, obviously it doesn't mean to kill the animals or harm the animals even. Quite the opposite. It was that Adam was to manage the animals, and they were his responsibility in some sort of respect. And we see this a bit further on in Genesis, where we see that Adam named the animals, which is kind of how this word dominion is meant to be implemented. So in general, mankind's role was actually to look after the natural world and not exploit it. And this is actually a lot of the themes within the law of Moses was stewardship of the natural environment. And as we get more and more understanding about the world in general, modern science says that it's better to have sustainable practices, to use resources wisely, don't litter, don't pollute. So these are all things that we've kind of learnt to do over time as a society through science and through societal change. But this is actually what God had in mind from the very beginning. So obviously God has designed the world in this kind of way, so that we're meant to manage it responsibly. And He's already, so God is all-knowing, and that we see this idea of intelligent design in how systems are designed and how God tells us to act in the world. So back at the very start of the Bible, God chooses the nation of Israel to be his special nation. And that's where we see the law of Moses So this is an interesting kind of sustainability practice that we practice here in South Australia in terms of fishing management. But we also see a similar sort of management of resources instructed in the Bible. And so God has, in forming the nation of Israel, God laid out very specific laws about how a nation of people were to act. And very broadly, these laws are called the laws of Moses. So obviously, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of laws to deal with sin and their consequences. And that is not particularly the topic for tonight, although we will touch on it later on. So if we have a look now at Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 6. Now you might think that these, fishing laws are kind of just made up. Someone's kind of had an idea and then said, this is what you should do. But actually a lot of research has gone into this this management, and they've said this is the most sustainable way to keep this population of Australian salmon continuing on. And it's interesting if you see, obviously very small fish you're not meant to catch, but the medium-sized ones you can catch 20 of, but for the larger ones you catch less of. So it's interesting that there's a limit on the older ones, which are the breeding kind of, those would be the breeding population of fish. Now in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 6, we can see that there's a very similar policy or rule that God has recorded for the nation of Israel. Deuteronomy 22, verse 6. If you come across a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long. So obviously it's saying here, you need to treat the natural environment in a sustainable way. You can take some, but you must leave the rest. So obviously the parent bird can go off and lay more eggs, but obviously the young can't survive without the parent. So this is just one example of how God has said this is how we are to responsibly manage the natural world and have stewardship and dominion in that sense of the word over the natural environment. So what if we now think about land management and how in the world today we're kind of moving towards a more sustainable cropping systems, and we want to use the resources in a sustainable way. Well, if we turn to Exodus 23 verse 11, this was also implemented such a long time ago, thousands of years ago. Today we talk about carbon capture, carbon credits, sustainable farming. These are all seemingly new ideas that the world is seeing now to be very valuable in terms of maintaining the natural environment. So this is in Exodus chapter 23 verse 11, it says, "For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard." So this is so interesting that this is actually enshrined in law. Like, they had to do this, and it's obviously got a dual system and a dual meaning in the fact that this was actually providing for the poor as well. And obviously today we recognise that this is an important part of a functioning society, is that we need a welfare system, and it's important to look after the poor. And so every 7th year, this was what they had to do. They had to let their farms go wild, and it turns out modern science tells us that if you regenerate the soil, leave it go fallow, leave it go wild, it will actually be better in the long run rather than just taking all the nutrients out of the soil. And you might think in the short term, well, I really want to just, like, every year keep producing a crop, I can sell it, but we've actually starting to learn that it's you produce more through leaving things go fallow. So I'm just picking out a few examples here from the Law of Moses, but what about infectious diseases and health? Public health policy, there's a lot of people employed to figure out, how we should deal with COVID and what our policy should be. And, most of us would probably have had COVID by now, but right back at the start, just try and remember what the policies were. It's interesting to think how quickly we forget, but initially we were told we have to do 14 days of supervised quarantine, and that's how we would manage this infectious disease. So this is from the National Review of Hotel Quarantine for COVID. Just think about how much research and how many smart people were trying to work out how they should manage this infectious disease. And this is the very first paragraph of the review. It says, Australia implemented international border restrictions early in the course of the pandemic in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. From 28th of March 2020, all returning travellers have been required to undertake 14 days of quarantine in a designated facility. Since then, some 130,000 international and domestic travellers have been quarantined, which slows the spread of COVID-19 in Australia. So it's probably much more since since it was written in terms of quarantine. But so initially we did have to quarantine for 14 days, which involved testing as well. We would test to see if we had it. There was a diagnostic test. So now let's look at Leviticus chapter 13, verse 4. So initially we had 14 days, and then it came down to 7 days of quarantine as more and more people got infected. And so we had this diagnostic test that we could do at specific time periods throughout quarantine. And this is because we didn't want the virus to spread. And of course our policy has changed because now we don't mind that it is spreading so much, I guess. But Leviticus chapter 13 verse 4 tells the nation how to manage this infectious leprous disease. So this explains the diagnostic test to see if a patient has this particular type of disease. It says, the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body. So now it's got like a list of symptoms, which if if they're all this symptom, then they've got the disease. So if the hair in the disease area has turned white and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, is a case of leprous disease. When the priest has examined him, he should pronounce him unclean. But if the spot is white and the skin of his body appears no deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest shall shut up the diseased person for 7 days. So that's, if you're not sure whether you've got the disease, you need to be self-isolated for 7 days. Interesting. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and if in his eyes the disease is checked and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall shut him up for another 7 days. So then you get 14 days of quarantine to see if you have the disease or not. It's just so interesting that it's exactly the same 14 days. And it's just so amazing to see how consistent this national health practice is compared with the nation of Israel, which was ancient times, 3,300 years ago. So this is the process God wanted them to follow. So first you have to get the correct diagnosis of the disease. Is it this type of skin disease, or is it a different one? And it's the same today. We go to the doctor to get diagnosed. We first need an accurate diagnosis. Does this match up with all the symptoms? Do you have some of the symptoms but not others? Well, then you need to wait and see if the symptoms develop or not. But while you wait, you also need to self-isolate so you don't spread the infection. And ensure personal hygiene, and later in the chapter we see washing the clothes and things like that. So these public health measures are actually way ahead of their time. It's like before ancient times, and still thousands of years later we're still implementing the 14 days quarantine period. So it's interesting to see that these laws in the law of Moses are not outdated at all. They're actually extremely relevant and current. They're still upheld by modern science and are a testament to the fact that these laws were written by a being who has complete and utter understanding of the world that we live in. So I'll now pass over to Josiah for his section on the evidence of the flood.
Thanks for that, Pete. It is totally amazing how the Bible teaches us things that have taken humans thousands of years to discover for themselves. Now, last week we looked a lot at what we don't see in the fossil record and how this disproves evolution. This week we want to look at what we do see in the world around us and explain how this is what we expect based off an event like the biblical flood. This is a less direct way of proving that we are here by design, but by proving world history matches up to what is contained in the Bible, we give strong evidence to believe God exists and that He is the creator of everything around us. To introduce this section and to set the background, we'll have Uncle Steve come up just now and read for us Genesis chapter 7.
Good evening, everybody. Reading from Genesis chapter 7. And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark. For thee I have seen righteous before me in this generation. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens, the male and his female, and of the beasts that are not clean by two, the male and his female. Of fowls also of the air by sevens, the male and the female. to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. And Noah did according unto all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of water was upon the earth. And Noah went in, and his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives with him into the ark, because of the waters of the flood. Of clean beasts and of beasts that are not clean, and of fowls and of everything that creepeth upon the earth, there went in 2 and 2 unto Noah into the ark, the male and the female, as God had commanded Noah. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. In the selfsame day entered Noah, and Shem, and Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them, into the ark. They and every beast after his kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and every fowl after his kind, every bird of every sort. And they went in unto Noah into the ark, 2 and 2 of all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. And they that went in male and female, of all flesh, as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth. And the pillars prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth. And the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. And all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 6.8 metres upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died. And every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days.
Thanks for that, Uncle Steve. I thought we might start with a quick whiteboard brainstorm session again. And we'll be looking from our reading in Genesis chapter 7 at the evidence that we might see there in our earth today and in the geological record for the story we see in Genesis chapter 7. What effects did the flood have on the earth? There's only a few points here, so it'll be rather quick, but what evidence do you think we might see of the story of Genesis chapter 7 with the flood on the earth nowadays? Yes. So maybe I write lots of dead fossils. Oh yeah, large areas of them gathered together, yeah.
Like unusual things on like the top of mountains, like where, stuff like that.
So evidence of water reaching the mountains? Yeah, that's a good one. Oh yeah. Yep. Maybe layers of soil created by the flood. Another question is, how long was the effects of the flood? It tells us in this chapter how long was the effects of the flood seen on the earth. It does say that number, but if you look at, try comparing chapter 7 verse 11 and 8 verse 14. I think the waters were increasing 150 days.
What about stories of passed down floods on places around the world?
Yes, we do. We won't discuss that tonight, but that is another one. There's plenty of stories in many different cultures of the flood. Legends. Yes. Yep. 1 year long. There's one other interesting point. In 7 verse 11, it mentioned, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. This is an interesting side point, but it indicates that another source of water was present to add to all the floodwaters. Scientists often argue there's not enough rain in the clouds to flood the earth, but if we have potentially the ocean bottoms rising and allowing water out of them, that adds more water to the whole flood that could flood the earth. That's good. I think I got all my points there. Thank you. So we'll roll into our first piece of evidence for a worldwide catastrophic flood. That being the discovery of fossilised marine creatures found thousands of metres above sea level. One such example of these are the marine fossils found high up in the Himalayas on Mount Everest, which we all know pretty well, buried in sedimentary layers of limestone. Marine fossils like the cephalopods shown on the slide behind me. All geologists agree that the ocean waters had to have buried these fossils, and that the limestone beds containing these fossils could only have been formed when the land was completely covered by the ocean waters. We see another example of this in the fossils found in the Grand Canyon. Scientists have discovered marine fossils such as corals, lilies, clams and marine snails that are not only situated in the Grand Canyon far inland, but are also 2,100 metres above sea level. This gives good evidence to support the Bible's account of the sea levels having once risen to cover the whole earth. The fact that there are fossils at all is actually good evidence for the biblical flood. It is reasonably rare for fossils to form. Fossils are only formed when sediment covers an organism very soon after it dies, protecting it from scavenging animals and erosion and decay. As you can imagine, it is fairly unusual for organisms to immediately become covered in soil as soon as they die. This often relies on a disaster event covering them. If there had been a flood, though, you'd expect there to be millions of fossils around the place, evidence of huge amounts of water rapidly burying plants and animals. And this is exactly what we do see. We see massive fossil graveyards that could only have been produced by the rapid burial of these organisms on a massive scale. One such example of these gigantic fossil graveyards is once again in the Grand Canyon. Billions of squid-like fossils, along with other marine fossils, are found in 2-metre tall limestone layer in the Grand Canyon. This fossil graveyard stretches for 290 kilometres across northern Arizona and southern Nevada, covering an area of at least 30,000 square kilometres. Another fossil graveyard containing over 100,000 fossil specimens representing more than 400 different species have been recovered in a shale layer associated with the coal beds near Chicago. Organisms such as ferns, insects, scorpions, jellyfish, mollusks, crustaceans and fish were preserved, often with their soft parts and structures exquisitely preserved. In northern Tasmania at the Fossil Bluff, thousands of marine fossils are buried, along with a possum and a whale being buried together. We often find this marine species buried next to terrestrial or land species in these fossil graveyards. And this is strong evidence for a catastrophic flood that covered the whole earth, mixing and burying all these land and marine species together. Millions of soft-bodied marine creatures like jellyfish have been fossilised right here in South Australia, in the sandstone bed in the outback, which spans over 1,000 square kilometres. Soft-bodied creatures such as jellyfish should rarely be seen in the fossil record. They consist only of soft jelly and would normally decompose very quickly. Only a catastrophic rapid burial could fossilise such soft-bodied creatures. In fact, the discoverer of these perfectly preserved soft-bodied creatures in the outback concluded that all of them must have been buried in less than a day. Even the vast amount of coal in the earth gives evidence of huge amounts of vegetation being fossilised. We know that coal is created from fossilised plants being placed under lots of heat and pressure. So the large deposits of coal present in the earth indicate billions of fossilised plants. The fossil record gives abundant evidence for rapid catastrophic burial of millions of different species across the planet. And this is exactly what we'd expect in the case of a worldwide flood. We see millions of dead plants and animals, often perfectly preserved within layers of sand, mud or limestone that were created during the flood. PhD geologist Andrew Snelling proposes that even these layers of sand or limestone give proof for the biblical flood, due to the evidence for these sedimentary layers being carried vast distances. He claims that there are many examples in the geological record of sedimentary rock layers that did not originate from the erosion of rock layers below them. These layers instead seem to have been transported large distances from other sources. In the example on the screen, where you can clearly see a white layer on top of a dark red layer, indicating that this white sandstone could not have been formed from the erosion of the rock that is below. It's red and it's the wrong colour. Scientists claim that certain sandstone beds in North America originated further north in Canada. They claim that the Navajo sandstone grains were transported 3,000 kilometres south from Canada right down to Utah in North America. This might seem a little far-fetched, and yet there have been more than 500,000 measurements collected from over 15,000 different locations in North America, indicating this direction of water flow through the geological record. On top of this, the only explanation evolutionists can come up with for this is a massive transcontinental river system that would have flowed for millions and millions of years. But this is impossible, even in their belief system. It is impossible for enough water to be flowing consistently for so many years, for so many millions of years. There are many examples across every continent of sedimentary rock layers covering vast areas. Many of these layers can be traced the whole way across continents, even in between different continents. One such example is North America and Europe, which have the same chalk beds and limestone layers, containing the same fossils preserved within. All this evidence indicates massive amounts of water sweeping and covering entire continents in sedimentary layers. One last piece of evidence for the flood we gain from the many layers of strata in the earth is the evidence for the plastic-like nature of these rock layers. It is displayed in the folds and bends some of these rock layers exhibit. Plastic here means that these rock layers seem to be soft and mouldable rather than hard and brittle. Evolutionists claim that these different layers in the rock account for millions of years of a slow build-up of these layers. Layers of rock formed in this process will always be very hard and brittle, as they have been compacted and compressed and dried out over a long time, the opposite of plastic. Yet we find layers of rock in the Grand Canyon that seem to display highly plastic characteristics. You can see the example on the screen. The rock here shows massive folds in it, and yet there should also be massive fractures in this rock if it were hardened over 440 million years, which is how long evolutionists predict these layers sat for before they were folded. However, if these layers were formed all at once during the flood, we would of course expect them to stay moist and very mouldable, easy to fold without causing massive fractures. There could even be dramatic bends in the rock, like in the example behind us, without fractures. These layers of rock in the Grand Canyon must have been rapidly deposited, allowing them to stay soft and malleable as the tectonic plates below moved around, bending these layers. This is just another small piece of evidence, adding weight to the fact that the many sedimentary layers found in our Earth are not a product of millions of years, but purely a massive catastrophic flood. Our last proof for the biblical flood tonight from the fossil record is that of polystrate trees. These are fossilised trees found standing upright in the fossil record. These are quite common and are found all over the world. Two examples are shown on the screen behind me. These fossilised trees are amazing as they span multiple layers of strata. This is utterly impossible in the evolutionist timescale, as evolutionists would normally assign at least thousands, if not millions of years to these formation of rock layers. There is no way these trees, or even just the tree trunks, could stay standing for thousands of years, let alone millions of years, without rotting and decaying. These vertically fossilised tree trunks are often found in coal deposits as well. Derek Ager, a professor of geology, says this in one of his books. If one estimates the total thickness of the British coal measures as about 1,000 metres, laid down in about 10 million years, then assuming a constant rate of sedimentation, it would take 100,000 years to bury a tree 10 metres high, which is ridiculous. Alternatively, if a 10-metre tree was buried in 10 years, that would mean 1,000 kilometres in a million years, or 10,000 kilometres in 10 million years. This is equally ridiculous, and we cannot escape the conclusion that sediments at times must have been, that sedimentation was at times very rapid indeed, and at other times there were long breaks in sedimentation, though it looks both uniform and continuous. Derek here shows that it is totally impossible for these coal mines to have slowly formed around these tree fossils. All this evidence supports the biblical flood record, the biblical record of a flood. We have seen marine fossils deposited high in mountains, gigantic fossil graveyards, massive sedimentary layers that span over continents and seem to have been transported over long distances. And lastly, these polystrate fossils, which exist reaching through many layers of strata. All this evidence indicates a massive catastrophic flood, which covered the whole Earth, rapidly depositing many sedimentary layers and thus burying and creating millions of fossils. This evidence for a global flood supports the fact that there is an all-powerful creator of our universe who caused catastrophic events like this, like the flood, and who was the designer of our world and everything in it. I'll now hand over to Pete for our last section tonight.
Thanks, Josiah. So I guess for the last section tonight, we've kind of talked about design and purpose and evidence for God's handiwork. And so for this last section, I wanted to come at this concept from a different angle. And I think when we look at the world, it's fairly clear that God has designed the natural world, and in the world, in society, that's been fairly thoroughly debated. But I think something that's quite interesting to look at is the fact of how God has actually designed us and created us to work together with each other. Now, I know that as humans, there's flaws and there's sin, which has kind of derailed God's plan in a way, but obviously God has a plan to kind of get things to where back to the start in terms of the Garden of Eden. So so for this last section, I kind of wanted to look at what are the principles that the Bible teaches. So, like maybe, if you could just yell out, like, what sort of principles do you think that the Bible has and teaches which evolution doesn't teach? If that makes sense.
So like kindness.
Kindness, yeah, so that's a good one. Morality, yep.
A purpose to life.
Yep. Make a bit thicker line there. Yep. Any other virtues? Accountability. Yep.
Honesty and business dealings.
Yep. Honesty. Yep.
Order as well. We just hear by chance. It's not all arranged, whereas design reacts to order.
Yep. I've got one in mind that
Selfless.
selflessness. Yep.
Were you thinking of compassion or sympathy?
Yep. So it's related to that idea. Yep.
Love.
Yep. That's a good one.
We're looking to revere something higher than ourselves.
Yep. So
We're not the
yep. So
worship.
yep. Worship. Idea. I'd say reverence. Yep. Still haven't got the what I'm looking for.
Tell us. Just give us a clue. What does it start with?
Starts with F.
Friendship.
Yeah, close. No, yeah. So look, I think forgiveness is actually like a big one in the Bible, that it really helps in personal relationships, and it's something that is definitely not taught by the world at large. So, but yeah, I think all these are things that make society function really well, and everyone would say like these are good characteristics to have, but these actually all originate from the Bible, and you wouldn't kind of come up with them without some sort of higher morality and higher being. So a huge amount of the law of Moses deals with sin and with guilt. It's just interesting to look through the Bible and just see how much of it deals with the issue of sin. And as I said, God now has a plan of how we can kind of get things back on track, for want of a better analogy. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 18, verse 21. And if we look at society as a whole, sin is just a huge issue in society that is very challenging to deal with. It creates guilt and negative feelings for the sinner and for the victim as well. But most importantly, it breaks our relationship with God. And obviously God's design and plan and purpose for us is that ultimately we will live in a sinless society. And obviously we can't achieve that currently, but God has designed this plan of how we can get things back on track. And I think forgiveness is actually a godly characteristic, specifically godly, and I think it's the foundation of any long-term community. It helps people to move on from issues, and just imagine trying to live in a household where no one forgave anyone for anything, and you would just stack up this list, and you would just remember all these minor issues forever, and it would not be a great society. So now Matthew chapter 18 verse 21, and I think this is worth spending some time on. The thing is that God knows that we all sin, and he actually knows every single one of our sins, whereas no one else would know all our sins. We can only know people's public sins. Matthew chapter 18 verse 21. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? 7 times. But Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven... So now Jesus gives this analogy of what this question Peter has been asking, what it's kind of like. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. So if we think about 10,000 talents in today's terms, it's about 200,000 years of wages. It's just an impossible amount that he owes. Verse 25, and since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him of the debt. But that same servant went out. He found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So a denarii is about 1 day's wage. So this was still a significant amount, about 4 months of work, of wages. But compared to the original debt, this is minuscule. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me and I will pay you. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed. So the master ends up coming back and saying, you haven't had mercy on your servant, so I'm not going to forgive you. And so the point is that we have to forgive others because we are so indebted to God for his forgiveness to us. We're hugely indebted to God for forgiveness, and it's not something we can just pay with what we have. So this is essential for a functioning society, and this is what God wants for us. That's God's design for us, is that we should be forgiving people. And if we think about what the world tells us, like the world will tell us to file a lawsuit, gather the evidence, argue it out in court, and talk to lawyers first before we talk to anyone else. And then when you're in court, get as much money as you can, because the money will solve everything. That will solve the problem. Well, we know that doesn't actually solve anything. And these these people will hold grudges for the rest of their lives and just be absolutely eaten up by this issue. And is this maybe why we're experiencing a mental health epidemic? If we look at some statistics, so this is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Since 2014-15, anxiety-related conditions have increased in people aged 0 to 24 years, from 10.3% to 14.5%. At the same time, people aged 45 to 64 years have observed increases in anxiety-related conditions and depression or feelings of depression. So that's so interesting, isn't it, that these problems are just increasing in society. But we know that forgiveness has the opposite effect on health. The Harvard Medical School says that observational studies and even some randomized trials suggest that forgiveness is associated with lower levels of depression, anxiety, and hostility, reduced substance abuse, higher self-esteem, greater life satisfaction. And it also notes forgiving people is not always easy. So are these two things related, or is this just coincidence? And has society forgotten how to forgive? And it is hard, but it's the right thing to do, even from a logical kind of reasoning to say this is healthy for you to forgive people. And God tells us in that quote that we've read that we need to forgive our brother from the heart. And we know that God forgives us if we are baptised and ask for God's forgiveness. And when this is the case, because this is the case, we need to forgive others. So I just, now you all may have heard of the Eva Kors story, and I just wanted to look at this as a bit of a case study of forgiveness. And it's interesting that we've got these two sides where society says you should get as much as you can out of people and don't settle for anything less. And here she has been terribly wronged with Nazi experimentation. And the Holocaust was one of the worst events in history. Millions of Jews were killed mercilessly by the Nazis. And Eva and her twin sister suffered terrible experiments at the hands of the infamous Nazi doctor called Mengele. So obviously she and her sister survived, but continued to live with the trauma of what had happened to them. They'd seen terrible things and experienced terrible things. And she was trying to think and figure out how she could move on, how she could get over this trauma. And she actually found this Nazi doctor still alive in Germany, Dr. Munch. And Dr. Munch was sympathetic, and he had actually struggled with the guilt of what he had done. Now, he hadn't actually been doing torture or anything like that, but he had actually signed the death certificates for the Jews that had died in the gas chambers, and that really weighed on his mind, and he had nightmares about that. So they met up, and they actually both travelled to Auschwitz, and they signed this joint statement that said, this is what have happened, we've witnessed it, and we're sorry that it's happened. So Eva really appreciated this gesture, and she thought for months, like, how can I thank this man? And she wrote this forgiveness letter to say, I forgive you. And so this is what she said. Then the idea of a forgiveness letter came to my mind. I knew it would be a meaningful gift, but it became a gift to myself as well, because I realised I was not a hopeless, powerless victim. At first I was adamant that I could never forgive Dr. Mengele, but then I realised I had the power to forgive. It was my right to use it, no one could take it away. The day I forgave the Nazis privately, I forgave my parents, whom I hated all my life, for not having saved me from Auschwitz. Children expect their parents to protect them, mine couldn't, and then I forgave myself for hating my parents. So this is what she says. She says, forgiveness is really nothing more than an act of self-healing and self-empowerment. I call it a miracle medicine. It is free, it works, and has no side effects. I believe with every fibre of my being that every human being has the right to live without the pain of the past. For most people, there is a big obstacle to forgiveness because society expects revenge. It seems we need to honour our victims, but I always wonder if my dead loved ones would want me to live with pain and anger until the rest of my life. Some survivors do not want to let go of the pain. So that's interesting. This woman is outside the Bible. She is separate, but she's realised that this idea, this concept of forgiveness is actually quite powerful. And, you know, we know that the biblical kind of take on forgiveness. And we know that it's powerful good. And it's interesting there how she says that society expects us to have revenge. But obviously the research tells us that forgiveness works and it's powerful. So it's kind of illogical to say two opposite things. And we know that this is one of the key messages of the Bible. Romans 4 verse 6 says that just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sins. So this then is the whole blessing and whole message of the Bible, the forgiveness of sins. And if you think, well, we're just here by chance, well, what's the relevance of sin? What's the need for forgiveness? These are moral terms, and evolution doesn't teach morality. Well, we know that it is the case that every functioning community needs forgiveness. Forgiveness is a biblical concept, and it's a totally foreign concept to evolution. If we want to know about forgiveness, we wouldn't go to an evolution textbook, but we know the world says forgiveness is so powerful. Forgiveness helps us move on. It frees us from the past, and it helps solve so many problems we see in the world today. So as you go away from tonight, I would challenge you to give forgiveness a go. Try it out. See if it works. See if you can do it. It is difficult to do, but give it a go. And as we've seen tonight, there are enormous health benefits. And we talked about meaning and purpose in life, and this is through forgiveness. This is where you can find meaning in your life. So over the last 2 nights, we've covered a lot of ground. So are we here by design or chance? I hope we've answered that question for you. And hopefully you've been able to consider the vast wealth of evidence that we have for design. Last week, we looked at the improbability of life coming about by random chance. And we know that these are absolutely impossible odds. How could this possibly happen by chance? We looked at how the planet has been put together and it's perfectly calibrated to sustain life. And then Josiah looked at the flaws in evolutionary logic and the inconsistencies in carbon dating and other forms of historic dating. And clearly the world has been put together by an intelligent being, as we read in Genesis chapter 1. Tonight we've looked closer at the biblical record. We've seen the laws of Moses are not outdated at all. They're still very consistent with practices today. And actually, they were way ahead of their time and evidently written by an intelligent, all-knowing creator. Josiah then looked at evidence for the flood, the fact that all over the world there are fossils which show rapid burial of animals and plants, completely consistent with the biblical record of a worldwide flood. And lastly, we've looked at morality as taught in the Bible. We've looked at forgiveness and how this is an essential part of communities and daily life, but is a concept that's entirely foreign to evolutionary theory. So we can see that God has a purpose and design for each of us. He's designed this world to be inhabited, but obviously sin has come in conflict with that plan. Sin created flaws in this world that God has created, but He has a purpose and plan with all of us to restore things back to perfection. So He wants you to be part of this design and this purpose for the world. There is a purpose to life, and that is what the rest of the Bible is all about. So thanks everyone for coming out tonight, and I hope this has been useful. So next week, we'll look at what happens when we die by Toby Luke, and so we'd all invite you back to that talk as well. So thanks again everyone for coming out, and we'll close with prayer tonight if you'll all stand. Dear Lord God, we come before you at the close of our night together to thank you for the plan that you have laid out for us and the purpose you have for us in life. We ask that you help to open our eyes to all the evidence that we see around us in the fact that you have designed this world and you've laid out your plan for how you want us to be in this world. So Lord, please help us to understand you more and to understand what you would have us do, and please help us to help manifest these virtues that you have recorded in your Bible. We thank you for the time together now and the supper that you've provided for us. We know that you provide everything that we need in this life. So we thank you for all things through Jesus Christ's name. Amen.